Do you have someone in your world you argue and debate with all the time? I'm not talking about serious fights or arguments, but things like great bands or the greatest football team. For me, that person is my brother-in-law. Having a brother-in-law is awesome. It's like having a brother, except he doesn't beat you up as a kid. Generally speaking, they're great guys. But there's one brother-in-law of mine that I argue with all the time. No, I don't fight with him about politics or religion or parenting tactics. We get into greatest of all time spats. I call them GOAT debates. Just to be crystal clear, GOAT stands for greatest of all time. The topics are completely random. We discuss things like, what's the greatest video game of all time? Who's the greatest basketball player of all time? What's the greatest toy of all time? Who is the greatest guitar player of all time? Or what's the greatest movie of all time? These conversations always start out lighthearted. We're usually just trying to make time pass at family functions, but they always turn into passionate arguments. Why? I have no idea. Maybe he's just a guy I love to disagree with. Maybe we both think that the time will pass faster if we really give our heart and soul to the disputes. But there's one thing that always seems to be true about our GOAT debates. We're both 100% confident in our answers. On numerous occasions, both of us have said things like, yeah, he may be the second or third greatest basketball player of all time, but he's certainly not the greatest. Or that video game may be in my top 5 greatest of all time, but it's certainly not the greatest of all time. There's a reason why people don't debate things like, what is the 6th greatest movie of all time? Because debates like that simply aren't interesting. People just don't care about who places after first. People want to know, what's the greatest? Why? Because isn't it true that the things we think are the greatest are things we like? It's the things we are for. That's why no one says, I'm for dentist appointments, research papers, and household chores. Those are the greatest ways I could spend my time. No, essentially, you and I are for the things that are greatest to us. If playing soccer is the greatest way you can spend your time, then you're for soccer. If dating multiple girls at the same time is the greatest way you could spend your weekends, then you're for being a player. Basically, for and greatest go hand in hand. In the same way, none of us are for things or people that we feel like are against us. When you think about your greatest friend of all time or the greatest teacher you ever had, they were definitely people who were for you. They were on your team. People don't talk about the greatest teacher and say, even though I felt like she hated me, my chemistry teacher had the most knowledge of her subject and she actually had fantastic techniques for empowering us to learn the subject. So she was actually the greatest teacher I've ever had. No, if you feel like someone is against you, there's no way they're making it into the greatest category. Now think about this idea when it comes to God. Because I think we've all had those times when we've wondered, is God for or against me? Sure, if we were put on the spot in church, we'd say he's for us. But if we were honest in real life, we'd admit that even though we know how we think we should answer, the truth is, sometimes it feels like we're in the God is against me category. Maybe we get the feeling that God is against us from being around other Christians or being in church, seeing Instagram posts, overhearing conversations in the hall at school, or reading different blogs. Seeing things like that makes us wonder if God is more of an against God than he is a for God. Because isn't it true that Christians spend a lot of time talking about what God is against? And don't you sometimes feel like God is against you because you've been doing something or you're struggling with something that you're pretty sure he's against? Let's bring it all full circle with this question. Do you feel like the greatest thing to God is that we don't do the things he's against? Growing up, I spent most of my time convinced that God was against me. Then one day, I came across an interaction in scripture that we're going to look at today. It cleared up some things for me, and hopefully, looking at it today, it will help you decide if God is a for God or an against God. One of the many reasons why God chose to send us Jesus is to give us a picture of what he's like. Jesus was literally God in human skin who walked among us. It gave people a human, physical picture of God. That means if you want a valid answer for who God is, look at Jesus. Jesus shows us what God is like. But not all people accepted Jesus with open arms. As you probably know, they eventually had him killed. In fact, they set an actual murderer free in exchange to have Jesus killed. So although Jesus helped, blessed, noticed, and encouraged thousands of people, there were people who didn't like him. Why? Well, for starters, Jesus claimed to be God. It wouldn't be easy to accept someone who claimed that today, so let's not be too quick to judge people for having a tough time accepting it back then. And Jesus was different. He was different for obvious reasons, like he was perfect, and that's tough to handle, but also because he challenged their religious views. Religious people of Jesus' time followed something called the law. I'm not talking about obeying speed limits and curfews. They followed a religious law. And since they felt confident that this religious law came from God himself, it was highly controversial when anyone challenged it. And because Jesus was so different, so difficult for people to figure out and put in a box, they often struggled to know if Jesus was a great teacher of the law or a guy who was trying to destroy the very law that God spoke into existence. Because of that, religious people were always trying to catch Jesus breaking the religious law or saying something that undermined it. And when they built up the courage, they would even ask him questions in an attempt to trap him. What we're looking at today is no different. A very smart representative, kind of like a lawyer, of the religious people asked Jesus a question to test his understanding of and commitment to the religious law. Matthew records this in his account of Jesus' life. The scene opens up with the religious lawyer trying to trap Jesus. "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Now, there were a bunch of commandments, like 613 of them. Some were positive, do this. Some were negative, don't do this. Some of them you probably already know, like the 10 Commandments. This guy was basically asking Jesus, out of all the big commandments, what's the biggest? There's nothing strange about this question. As a matter of fact, when you go back to the beginning of our time, it's just like asking, who do you think is the greatest rapper of all time? Okay, it's not exactly like that, but you get the idea. In the case of religious obedience, people really wanted to know what Jesus' thought was about number one. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." The question wasn't shocking, and neither was the answer. Nobody is going to argue with the idea that the greatest thing you can do is love God as much as you can. The whole love God idea was a part of the prayer that Jewish people memorized from the time they were kids. But Jesus wasn't done. And the second is like it. Wait, what? No. When you're talking about the greatest, there can't be two winners. There aren't two college football national champions. There aren't two winners on The Voice. There's always a number one. But remember what we said earlier. Jesus was different. So if he wanted two greatest laws, there would be two. Jesus continues, love your neighbor as yourself. When Jesus mentioned this second command, it had far-reaching implications. And we'll get into some of those later in this series. But for the sake of time today, I just want you to know and draw in one simple point from Jesus' answer to the religious lawyer. According to Jesus, the most important thing about us is what we're for and not what we're against. If you ever get a chance to study the bigger picture of Jesus' life on earth, and I hope you do, as recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll see tons of interactions Jesus had with people. And although the subject matter of this interaction is certainly one of the most important, when you study all of Jesus' interactions and responses to questions, you'll notice something. Jesus rarely responded with what he was against. People wanted to know what Jesus thought about certain groups of people who were a different ethnicity, were a different gender, who were very old or very young, had a lot of power or none at all, came from a different religious background, came from no religious background, made different behavioral choices, made bad behavioral choices, had nothing good to offer anyone. And if you study those interactions alongside Jesus' actions, you'll notice something else. Most of Jesus' controversy revolved around the people he loved and was for. Because when you love someone, you are for them. It doesn't mean you're for all of their choices or their behavior, but it means you want them to win. You want what's best for them. But still, people lost their minds when Jesus ate with sinners, embraced outcasts, and loved people who were rejected by every religious person they had ever met. Jesus' message of for changed the world. And when you see what Jesus was for, and you hear what Jesus said is the greatest command we could follow, you're clearly pointed toward a big truth. God is for you. God is not an against God. And to Him, the greatest thing about us is what we're for. Whether you've been convinced for a long time that God is against you, or you've been convinced that God is more for you than He is anyone else, I want you to simply respond to Jesus' greatest message by doing two small things. First, memorize this verse. If this verse represents the greatest thing to Jesus, then I believe that you and I can figure out a way to memorize it. Be creative. If you can memorize Drake and Taylor Swift lyrics, I believe that you can memorize this simple verse. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm not forcing you to agree with it. I'm simply asking you to memorize it. And the second thing I want you to do, pay attention to who you're for and against. You don't have to write it down or say it out loud, but when you hear about a person in your school and something bad they've done, or a group of people and what they represent, someone who thinks or believes differently than you or anybody else, just say to yourself, I just took a stand or built a case against them in my mind. Become aware of it. That's all. Just pay attention. When Jesus spoke of the greatest commandment, He talked about what He is for. And what we learn is simple. God is for us. After all, He loves us and created us. We have a lot of worth to Him. And while He could have focused this moment on all the things we should or shouldn't be doing, He didn't. He brought a message of for to a group of people who were so focused on what and who God was against. As you head out today, if you've been convinced that God is against you, I want you to ask yourself, how would it change my approach to God if I truly believed that He is first and foremost for me? And if you found yourself as a Christian wondering who you should be against, I want you to imagine, even just for a second, what it would look like for you to be for that person, even if you disagree with them.